Welcome to Humanity in Deep Space, an initiative involving a planetary conversation surrounding the range of interconnected issues and hard challenges ranging from science to health to food, design, economics, governance, space and planetary ethics, etc., that must be addressed as our species continues the transition to deep space. This is episode 16, A City on Mars. Can we settle space? Should we settle space? And have we really thought this through? Humans have long dreamed of establishing a settlement on Mars. In their best-selling book, A City on Mars, Kelly and Zach Weinersmith break down this dream into its various parts in great detail. Dr. Kelly Weinersmith received her PhD in ecology at the University of California, Davis, and is an adjunct faculty member in the BioSciences Department at Rice University. Her research has been featured in The Atlantic, National Geographic, BBC World, Science, and Nature. Zach Weinersmith is the cartoonist behind the popular geek webcomic Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal. He co-wrote the New York Times Bestsellers Soonish and A City on Mars, and illustrated the New York Times Bestselling Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration. His work has been featured by The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, Forbes magazine, Science Friday, Foreign Policy, PBS, the RadioLab blog, Mother Jones, Discovery magazine, and more. Our moderator is Chris Kimmel, founder of Humanity in Deep Space and co-founder of the commercial space company Space Tango.
Hello, this is Chris Kimmel with Humanity in Deep Space. I want to welcome everyone to another one of our webcasts. I actually think this is our 16th or 17th webcast that we've done, in addition to several live events. So we've started to get a pretty good reservoir of information and podcast and information for everybody. But this is going to be a really special webcast. So I want to appreciate our panelists who will be here, which I'll introduce in a minute. And first of all, let me thank, as we always do, the sponsors of Humanity in Deep Space, not only these webcasts, but the other programming we do. Space 629, Kentucky Science Technology Corporation, National Stem Cell Foundation, the Serving Institute at NASA, the Shelgren Center at UK, Baird Financial, Space Tango, Media Collaboratory, the START program at the University of Kentucky, Higher Orbits, Interstellar Foundation, Visit Lex, and 22 Solutions. And thank all of those people and organizations very much for all the financial support and other kinds of support that they provide. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read A City on Mars, please pick it up and read it. I've done a lot of reading in my career about space and science and lots of other things. And it's probably one of the best books that I've ever read dealing with a lot of these issues. So it's worth the read. It's interesting. It's filled with really solid information, and it's also very enjoyable. The authors, Kelly and Zach, come from different disciplines. They've kind of converged on this and been able to put out a book that is incredibly readable and quite interesting. So having said that, let me start off by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves a little bit and say a little bit about themselves. So let's start out with Kelly.
I'm Dr. Kelly Weinersmith, adjunct faculty in the BioSciences Department at Rice University. I'm an ecologist, which doesn't sound like a very relevant discipline for a book about Mars, but that's all right. I made it through.
Oh, I'm Zach Weinersmith, and I'm mostly known as a cartoonist and illustrator and children's book author.
And thanks for the kind words about the book.
Well, yeah, Zach, what are some of the books you've done in the past?
Oh, wow. Mostly I draw a comic called Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal. My big thing recently is I had a children's version of Beowulf called Beowulf.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, a little different.
And let me also say to our audience, we have a great audience today from over 20 countries represented. As we go along, please feel free using the curated chat to ask any questions, or if you want to make a comment, I will see those as well as the panelists, and so we'll be happy to try to answer and get to as many of those as we can. So having said all of that, let's jump in. And first of all, I'd like to ask both of you a question to kind of start things off in terms of what led you to write this book, this particular book?
Well, So we had just finished writing a book called Soonish about emerging technologies, and it had 2 chapters that were related to space. One was about how the cost of launching mass to space was going down quickly, largely because of SpaceX. And another was about how space resources could one day be used to make space settlements. And after researching those chapters, we felt like, oh, space settlements are coming soon, and we're sci-fi nerds. So let's write the book about our upcoming decade where we become, a space-faring, space-settling species. And so we pitched that book to our publisher, and they accepted it. And then after 4 years of research, we wrote
2 years of research.
2 years into the 4-year research process, we realized we weren't writing the book we thought we were writing. We're writing a book about how there's actually still a lot of work left to do, but it's really interesting, fun work. And so that's the book we wrote instead. Does that sound?
Yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
And so what was it that brought your two different disciplines together to write this book? Was Soonish, was that also co-authored by both of you?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
To be honest, most of what both of us did was just nosing around technical documents. I mean, I know, so like, I think to the extent we had unique collaborations, it was Kelly's background in science and in biology in particular is a skill that involves lots of deep dives and grinding through data. And I did a lot more work on sort of polishing up the text to get it to be readable and hopefully a little bit funny. But there was a lot of overlap.
And I think in general, the most important skill was just like the willingness to sit in front of textbooks and take notes for hours every single day. Which you don't really
One thing I liked about it was I've always said, there's no such thing as useless knowledge. And I think the two of you brought together and demonstrated that, while somebody may look at it and go, what's this have to do with something else? They're all actually all the same in terms of insight and information and helping us as humans figure this stuff out. So before we really get into it, I want to also make a comment about, which I found interesting about the book. And I've often said, as we begin some of these particular webcasts about these kinds of topics, this isn't about saying we should go or we shouldn't go. And I like that your book kind of started out that way. I mean, nobody's saying that, those are big questions that others need to answer. But regardless of that, I think personally, we are going to go. I don't know exactly when, but I think it is part of humans' future and destiny, one way or the other. But regardless of that, I think everyone agrees that when we do go, we need to be realistic about the challenges and problems. I read once by an entrepreneur who was a successful entrepreneur who said, the biggest mistake an entrepreneur can make is underestimating the competition. And I've always also taken that to mean underestimating the challenges. And so I think one of the things that your book really does well is without being overly pessimistic or negative, but being very realistic and candid about the myriad of challenges and hard problems that we face and that we need to solve if we're going to do this successfully and responsibly. So having said that, let me just start talking out by some of the general issues that you address, and then what I'm going to get into, I think we'll transition talking about some of the first ones, which will be the social and biological. But
so one of the first problems that we researched that surprised us was how human bodies respond to space. So, that we've had space stations orbiting Earth since the 70s, and so we assumed that we knew how the human body would respond to, a place like the moon or Mars. But of course, those space stations weren't put up there explicitly with the goal of preparing us for settling space. And so we haven't really been getting the data that we need. So for example, we don't understand space radiation very well. It's different than the kind of radiation we encounter on Earth, but our astronauts are protected from it to a large extent by Earth's magnetosphere. So we don't really have good data on how space radiation impacts the human body. And astronauts are in free fall, so they're experiencing something like no gravity, whereas Mars has like 40% Earth's gravity. And so we know that astronauts lose something like 1.1% of their bone mass in their hip every month. That's a lot. And we don't know if Mars's 40% gravity is going to does that number go to 0? That would be great. But if it goes to 0.1, and now instead of like a 6-month to 1 year trip, you're talking about decades of life, on Mars, then, I would not want to be the first woman giving birth and hoping that my hips hold out. because you've been losing that mass your whole life. And so there's just a lot that we still don't know because we just don't have the right kind of data yet.
Yeah, and I think in the book you point out that the longest time anyone has spent in space is 437 days in a row, which is a lot of time in one sense, but not much time if you're looking at a trip to Mars, which is probably a minimum of 3 years under the best of circumstances. So when we talk about you talk about bone loss, of course, that's with 2 or 3 hours of exercise every day as well.
Yes.
Do we have any getting back to that? There's no way to really test for these kinds of things. Analog missions are great for a few things, but obviously you're not putting people in space for long periods of time. You can't, there's no way to simulate microgravity or that kind of radiation exposure on Earth. So what are your thoughts on how do we as humans, as a species, begin to try to address some of those things?
Well, that's a tough one. So there are a couple areas we think would be the right place to put your investment. So for example, one thing we really need answers on is closed loop ecology, because people are going, oh, do you want me to address the medical stuff directly?
We could do the medical stuff first.
Yeah, sure. Well, so, we argue at the end of the book, like one of the big hard questions is reproduction. Because like that's an area of biology where we know almost nothing, and the stuff we do know about what happens to mature human bodies is already ominous. So when you start to imagine what it would do to a teenager to be in microgravity and radiation and maybe the hormone disrupting chemicals on Mars, etc., it gets pretty freaky. Problem is like how you get that data ethically. And also, even if you wanted to get it unethically, like the amount of time it would take to get the information you need, right? So like you basically just can't simulate that on Earth. Like the ideal place to simulate whether mammals, vertebrates can give birth successfully in space and have generations would be on the moon, we think. Or unless you wanted to pony up for like a rotating space station in a Lagrange point or something.
Well, you could have satellites.
Yeah. You could do small scale experiments with rats on a wheel.
Mm-hmm.
There's some cool stuff from JAXA recently in that direction. Although ideally, what you'd want is like to span decades and decades, and more complex creatures. Like I don't think you could keep a chimp in a rotating space wheel easily.
That would be tough.
Yeah.
And the last webcast we did actually was on reproduction in space, and one of the companies that was a central part of that was Spaceborne United from the Netherlands, and it's a company actually designed and developed to actually explore those kinds of questions. That's certainly a big issue. Also, talking about those kinds of things. I mean, there's also other kinds of a myriad of physical issues talking about our biology. We know things happen to the astronauts' eyes. We know about bone loss. I've seen some recent evidence that there's some evidence of neuropsychological physical problems for astronauts that are spending in a long time in space. So and since we can't simulate these kinds of things, I mean, I think it's interesting. What could we possibly do as interim steps, short of putting humans in space for 3 years and trying to figure out whether some of this stuff is going to impact us? I know there's no definitive answer, but could we do some things with, on an interim basis, like with, putting things in space in low Earth orbit or extending out beyond that?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that I think would be great is spending more time on the moon. So, you said Mars, like it
right.
takes time to get there, long time to get back. But, the moon, we can get there in a couple days. And so if you, send someone out there and you say, okay, we're going to see how this goes. You're going to stay there for 3 years. If about 1.5 years in, it became clear that they were having some massive physical problems or mental problems, then you could bring them back quickly. And so they wouldn't be stranded out there. So I think of the moon as a really great place for us to go to learn a lot of what we need for Mars.
Well, one thing I would add to that, so you had mentioned that Polyakov, who went up for 437 days, that's the record. I think if you look at the number of people who've been up for even 300 days, it's like 5 or 6. It's really small. So like, one of the problems we have from space station data is there's not that many people who've been up long term. And it's not as if there's like a perfectly designed systematic set of experiments to check out all of these problems. So like one thing you could do short of going to the moon would be to try to just get more people in space on a more scientific experimental basis. That could be done in low Earth orbit. Of course, now you have to pay for a space station, but
well, and that doesn't tell you about partial
It
gravity
does tell
or
you about
about
partial gravity,
radiation. Although there are some, of course, proposals for rotating space stations, so you could rotate it to get like 40%. So
my understanding from the space community and people from NASA is that's why it's theoretically possible. It's really, really expensive. And at this point, it may not be feasible. I've often wondered, and I've thrown this out a couple of times, and this may be somewhat uninformed, but if you look back at our early space program, it was a kind of an incremental. We started with Mercury, and then went to Gemini, Gemini, and then Apollo, and it was in stage. And I often wondered, and again, this is a very uninformed position, but I often wondered whether we ought to consider, like when we start talking about the Mars. I agree, extending our research and our capabilities on the moon and learning as much as we can, which makes sense. And then secondly, perhaps you send a crew out like we did in the early program. You send a crew out into deep space for 3 months. And it comes and turns around and comes back, and you say, okay, because once you're out, the other problem is with your lower orbit, you're still within the Van Allen belt and things like that. So you do need to really get out there where the radiation levels and things are much different, and you bring it back and say, okay, now what did we learn from this? I don't know what the cost, but I wonder if that something like that might be something to think about, as opposed to like, okay, we got the moon, now we're going to send people out for 3 years into deep space.
So it's interesting you mentioned that. So if you look at the sort of longer history, like von Braun was proposing, I think in the 50s, that before we do any moon landing, we should have like a large space station where people like hang out for a while, and you build like infrastructure so that you could have the like ability to send, say, I think he wanted to send like a dozen people to the moon, and they would mostly be scientists. But the approach that ended up getting taken because there was a time limit in the 60s was, we got to do the thing. And so there's a book by John Lodgton about how Kennedy made his decision and what the aftermath was. It argues essentially like the approach that ended up getting taken was exactly what you're talking about, like didn't set up steps. It was we have to do this one thing by any means necessary. So we have a kind of dead end setup. And so I agree, it would make much more sense to kind of like, so part of the problem, right, is like NASA is not the space settlement agency. If NASA was tasked specifically with, we need to eventually get to Mars, then you could start saying, well, first we do X, then we do Y, then we do Z, but that is not how it's done. And I think broadly speaking, and we talk about this in the book, but it's like, a lot of human spacefaring is fundamentally about politics. It's about governments showing power to each other. And so, the science is not always systematic, because scientists have to figure out ways to put science into these big, nationalist projects.
Yeah. I want to go on. Somebody made a comment here just a second ago. They're talking about the moon is also outside the Van Allen belt, and maybe there's that's a good interim point in terms of deep space. But there are also deep space issues that are beyond that. That again we need to understand and can't simply. So when you look at some of some of the biological and physiological issues we've got, which are a myriad of those, you've also got the neuropsychological issue, and that is one, the physical changes possibly in the brain, in the mind, as we go forward, and then there's just the psychological part of humans spending 3 years plus or minus in a very, very different situation. Obviously, in the early missions, not 200 years from now when we've got a higher regency on Mars, but the very early missions, however many of those are, you're looking at a crew of 6, 7 people, 8 people, whatever, in a ship going, and you've got all those kinds of things. And just thinking about the psychological aspect, which again, it's one of those things that people don't think about, but it's not minor. Even on the moon, you can see the Earth. All right, you look out and there's the Earth. It's different when you're going to deep space on a 3-year journey. And as Greg Schmidt from NASA pointed out to me one time, he says, once you're out there, there's no sense of movement. Right. There's only the hum of whatever's keeping the spacecraft going, and it's black and dark. Mm-hmm. And we don't really think about, what is the psychological effect potentially on humans, and what are some of the other things that we don't think a lot about that we're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, so we did a lot of research on psychology and sort of similar situations. So Zach read a giant stack of boring polar expedition diaries. You'd think that they'd be interesting, but they tell you about how many pounds of pemmican they ate per day. And then we did a bunch of research to see what we know so far about psychology on submarines. And this is another environment that's dangerous, and you get a lot of people in a cramped, tiny spot. Your fresh food runs out. and life in Antarctic research stations, and a lot of information about how astronauts fare when they're on the International Space Station. And, it seems like, when you are sailing to the North Pole and the land is going out of sight and you're not going to see it for years at a time, maybe that's analogous to what it would feel like to pull away and see Earth getting smaller. And they seem to do pretty well with stuff like that. And we seem to have a pretty good idea for what you need to keep morale high. So, you need as much as possible, like special foods. You want to celebrate holidays. You don't want to forget people's birthdays. You want to make sure you have music. And all of this information is sort of integrated into NASA's Human Integration Design Handbook. So what we've learned from these past situations has sort of been integrated. And one of the big takeaways for us was that it seems like when you have highly trained people who go through a selection process and then are given a bunch of information about how to handle living in stressful situations, and then they train together under high stress situations with the rest of the crew, and then you talk to them about, how to deal with mental health problems if you have them, they actually seem to do pretty well. So the data that we collected from those various different environments suggests you wouldn't necessarily expect psychology to be worse in space than it would be, on Earth. But there's a lot of problems with those data. And so one of the problems with the data is that astronauts are liars. And that's because they are incentivized to not talk about if they're having a bad day.
Right.
So like if you go to talk to this flight or to the psychiatrist before you're going to go up to the International Space Station, and you say, oh, I think I could be possibly having panic attacks, then you're not going to go.
Right.
And so,
and just to be clear, that's not speculative. Like we have like they mention it over and over in astronaut memoirs. It's not like we're talking about the game theory.
Right.
They do it.
Yeah. So we found, let's see, Mike Mullane in the days before electronic records literally pulled the papers out of his medical folder that like had problems before he handed it to the doctor when he was interviewed. And let's see, so one person thought they were having a heart attack. Was that Cunningham? Thought he was having a heart attack beforehand. Didn't mention that.
Yeah.
Another person was colorblind, but they memorized the tests for color blindness, and so they managed to get through. And so there's all sorts of stories.
Pretty clever, yeah.
And so like, let's see, Michael Collins actually felt like he was going to have a panic attack in a spacesuit. He called them nasty little coffins. They stressed him out. And so, but there is all these cases where people sort of say that they're okay when probably they're not. So we probably can't trust if the data says that astronauts are anxious 1 day out of 300, it's probably quite a bit more than that, but they're just not admitting it. But anyway, the point is the psychology data was actually much better than we thought it was going to be. I think, is that fair to say? But it's not regular people. It's like superhumans who received a bunch of extra training that do well. So when the rest of us are up there.
Yeah. No, again, not to belabor the point, and not to be overly pessimistic. I just going back, it's something humans have never experienced before. That kind of lengthy exposure, not only to deep space, but all the other things that come with it. Even in the absence of nature. I mean, all of us have evolved. Life from the beginning of time has evolved in the context of nature. And if you're on a ship going to Mars, it'd be nice to, we're going to grow roses in the ship, and that's going to take its place. But, that's probably, not going to be satisfactory. But having said that, I don't know, there are examples. You used a submarine, which I actually I got to know and did a webcast a while ago with several former naval officers, one of which was a nuclear attack sub captain. And be happy to introduce you guys to him. He's really interesting on the West Coast. And he talked about, they go underwater for 3 months, and, once they're underwater, that's it. They don't come to the surface unless it's, I guess if we have some super emergency. And it was interesting. One of the things he said is that when they will get to parasite depth, the crew will line up all the way down the ship to get 20 seconds.
Yeah.
Just to see the sun, to see the water. And I think that's kind of interesting, which brings me to another question, which he brought up and that you kind of alluded to. And that was, I asked him the question, it comes back to food. And I think that's another one of those issues that we have not given adequate attention to in terms of deep space. Certainly the moon as well, although it's 3 days away. People sometimes talk about, well, we have good data. We know from, ISS, but, they get fresh food delivered every 3 months or so. Now that's not the same, but it's not quite the same as we're looking at, particularly the moon's 3 days. So you got some of that, but into deep space. But when I asked Admiral Thomas after his crew selection, after they've done all the psychological testing, and you've got everybody selected and their crew, what's the most important thing that they have in terms of maintaining equilibrium and high performance of the crew? And he said food.
Yep.
Without a question.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, he said without question. Of course, they're able to have chefs. Sometimes they're trained but they train with 5-star chefs. They have freezers. So a little bit different situation. But at the same time, he emphasized how incredibly important that was to them as humans in doing this. And that's going to be one of those things we find difficult.
Submarines famously have the best food in the Navy. We read stories about like they bake pies fresh on site, which is interesting for space because you can't, right? You could heat up a pie, but most proposals for space you don't want, you have an atmosphere that's sealed, right? So you can't vent nasty outgassing. So you have to be really careful about any kind of like roasting. Certainly you're not frying anything or doing anything fun like that. What's interesting too is that kind of thinking, we found sources going back at least to the 19th century basically saying the exact same thing, that if you get the food right, a lot of other stuff is easy. So if you read, we didn't end up using a lot of it, but if you read diaries from polar exploration in the 19th century, they talk about food almost nonstop. And it's I don't know what it is. It's just like one of these few things that like, reminds you of home. But yeah, so the big challenge for long-term settlement is going to be making food on site, as you alluded to a bit earlier, which is like a real challenge, So on the ISS, it's mostly like little food packets. They've occasionally grown like onions and little leaf.
Lots of stuff up there.
Yeah, but like so in terms of like calories though, not a lot of what we need. And so that's a real problem. So you go to a place like the moon soil does not, you can't grow plants in it. You would have to amend it because it doesn't have enough carbon.
And a bunch of other stuff,
and a bunch of other problems beside. And so but the deeper thing is we don't even know like how to operate a sealed ecosystem. The biggest one ever is Biosphere 2, which had 8 people and they had just all sorts of problems, and they only lasted 2 years. So we don't have like a handbook that we need. And there's some small scale experiments that have been done, since the 60s. There are a few ongoing now, but they're very, very small scale. They have 2 to 3 people, or like one. I think the one in Europe doesn't even have humans in it. Is that right?
Yeah, Melissa
doesn't even have humans in it. So it's like this huge project that will take decades that needs to be started on, and no one is shelling out the money for it.
And the other thing is it's really time consuming. So like Biosphere 2, they were spending most of their time on essentially subsistence farming. And, a lot of the proposals that you see for Mars involve lots of very time consuming steps. And it seems to us that the astronauts are going to be double or triple booked if you're essentially subsistence farming while trying to make sure the toilet is working and cleaning the dust off of your solar panels. And it's just, there's going to be a lot to do when you're out there, which, it could be done. And the more robots that we have to help out, the better. But there's a lot we need to learn still.
When you talk to astronauts too, there's a lot of other issues that they, that are small issues in one sense, but large issues, particularly multiplied over time in a long period of time. The fact that they can't have anything crunchy on ISS because the debris gets into the atmosphere in the system, and things like that. And when you talk about food, you do get into things like taste and smell, texture, all these things that are we take for granted on Earth and have become a part of our our entire genetic being, in a sense, evolving over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. And it just seems to me that it's recognizing that you're not going to be able to do everything you'd like. It's got to be more than just we're going to give them pills every 3 days or something and they're going to be okay. Because as we had mentioned, it's not enough that they survive; they have to thrive. I mean, these are highly trained people who are going to have to be responsible for a tremendous amount of work and stress. And so it's not enough to say wouldn't Biosphere wasn't an example where they lost weight and
Yeah.
They lost 10 to 16.
I think the women were 10%, men were 18%, and they weren't like chubby people when they went in, right?
Yeah. But and when you read astronaut biographies, they always talk about missing stuff from home. Like when the Progress resupplies came with like apples and lemons, they would go on for pages about the smell of the apples and the smells of the lemons. And in Terry Virts's memoir, he was talking about how they queued up all of the laptops on the International Space Station so that they would all be playing the same track of the sound of rain falling for a weekend so that they could have just the sounds of home. And then Shannon Lucid was like super excited when she got her bag of M&Ms, and that's not even fresh, but just like there's things from home that
so someone just posted a very good point we should have mentioned, which is taste changes in microgravity. So this is well documented. So my understanding from what we read is that we don't actually know why. So the microgravity could, because the fluid shift could be doing something with your sinuses or messing with your smell, but there are other potential culprits. It could be like the humidity of the cabin. It could be that smell doesn't waft normally in a no gravity environment. But one of our favorite stories, Sid Gutierrez told the story of being on the shuttle and everyone was crazy for taco sauce. He had this story that people were putting taco sauce on Rice Krispies, which he would not admit to having done. But he said the captain, I'm sure this was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but he said the captain secured the supply of taco sauce because they were outstripping it and he was worried about morale. And then taco sauce became the medium of exchange on board the ship for the duration of the shuttle flight. So they do crave those piquant flavors.
And speaking of tacos, you mentioned the problems with crumbs. So most of the bread on the International Space Station on the US side is tortillas because they produce fewer crumbs. And I guess on the Russian side, they have what they jokingly call Barbie bread. It's just essentially bread that's like so small that you can pop the whole thing in your mouth, and so there's no crumbs. Crumbs also dictate the kind of food that you get to enjoy, at least until you land on Mars and the gravity helps you with the crumb situation.
Yeah, I got a quick anecdote. Tiffany Vora, who's a biologist out in the West Coast and has done a couple of these Mars analog missions. She mentioned to me one time, which is really interesting, that she was on one mission, I think it was 8 weeks or something like that. And again, taco sauce, all kinds of different things they were using. Well, it turned out that suddenly they discovered a little bit too late that all the consumption of taco sauce over a long period of time got kind of messed with the microbiome.
Oh no!
And they had some really serious issues
that you don't want to have in space.
That you don't want to have in space, and you don't even want to have there. And when they talked to their whoever their quote mission control was for this mission, they mentioned it. So what's going on? And of course it was typical of bureaucracy. Somebody there said, "Oh yeah, we probably should have told you about that."
Yeah, and it's funny. Every single spacecraft that we read about, there were problems related to the bathroom, and you could almost always read stories about things floating where they shouldn't be. On the shuttle, they were calling them brown trout.
Oh, God.
And of course, there's the famous transcript from the Apollo mission where they're trying to figure out who it belonged to.
Yeah, I know. That was that's.
Sorry.
No, but these are real. I mean, it's again, they're not earth shattering, but they're real issues. And you multiply these things over a long period of time, and 6 or 7 people in a confined space, and it gets pretty deep. Somebody talked, going back, you talked about, somebody mentioned here something about can we engineer plants to thrive in lunar or Martian regolith or some, I guess that's, certainly they're going to try to do that. Obviously we can't simulate particularly Mars regolith on Earth. And I'm sure that's something that we'll try to do. Have you any insights in that?
Well, for lunar soil in particular, the short answer is no, because the moon is carbon poor, right? So like a plant is something like 20 to 50% carbon. If you don't remember high school physics, you can't get carbon outside of stellar processes, so you have to bring it in, right? So you often see headlines that say something like plants grown in lunar soil, and they should read something like, so usually either they're in simulant soil, which typically does not chemically simulate moon soil, but also often, like there was the big thing recently, I think in 2022 was it, where they actually did grow plants in Apollo soil, and as Kelly mentioned earlier, they had a stress response. But the other thing about that is when we say grown in Apollo soil, what we mean is that they added water, atmosphere, sunlight, and nutrients, right? So if you've ever gardened, you know that if you add those 4 things to anything that is not plant poison, plants will grow. And they still had a stress response in that Apollo soil. So I think you could probably engineer or genetically engineer plants that would do well in lunar soil with those ameliorations, perhaps. But you can't just make plants that will grow in lunar soil. It's physically forbidden unless there's some kind of silicon-based life form or something.
Yeah, I'm sure artificial selection at some point will improve yields, but there's some stuff you're just not going to be able to get around.
Yeah.
Like you're going to need carbon.
Yeah, and of course, all things with food, you're dealing with volume too. I mean, it's it's nice to say we can grow this, but how many people are going to have to consume it, and can you get that kind of yield, can that kind of volume, and those kind of things. Back to you mentioned was interesting. You mentioned about where they use the screens in one of the missions to show a video of rain and things like that. So I wanted to circle back on the issue of what role do you think XR technologies, virtual reality technologies, et cetera, might be able to play with humans in terms of in a sense, convincing our brain that something else is going on other than what really is.
Yeah, I think that would probably be quite valuable. So to clarify, the rain was actually sound. Sound was quite valued. And they actually had other sounds like cafe noise. Actually, it was like a real assortment of earth sounds that people really appreciated. My initial reaction when you say VR is like people already have a problem with throwing up when they get to zero gravity. I try to imagine having the feeling of free fall while running a VR. I don't know, maybe you could get a good simulation of a roller coaster experience. But
on the surface of Mars.
Oh, on surface, yeah, no. I mean, I guess I don't know. I'd be curious to see. I guess what I would worry about a little is that you'd get be kind of depressing if your only access to like homey stuff was through a headset. But maybe it'd be good. I don't know. We know from like Mir. I think this is still true today. I think astronauts have access to the internet and Netflix and stuff. But even on Mir, which was very primitive by modern standards, they had a VCR with like VHS tapes of movies they would watch. It was like a non-trivial part of what they would do. So I think people are going to value their video. What are you smirking about?
Yeah, there was a live translation of Crocodile Dundee,
right.
where an American astronaut was translating it into Russian. And,
and that was actually considered a big deal because like the Americans, it was Michael Foale, so he was British, but
oh yeah,
it was very hard for them to learn Russian. Russian's a really hard language to learn, and they had to do a crash course. But Foale actually learned it, so he could live translate to Russian Crocodile Dundee and other movies, and that was considered very sort of kind and good team building.
Made him popular.
Made him very popular.
Yeah, that's pretty creative. Again, I'm not an expert on those kinds of technologies, but I deal with a lot of people who are, and it seems to me that the more sophisticated they get, there could be a role in ameliorating at least maybe some of the stresses. I don't think you can duplicate it, but it's probably going to be a multiplicity of things. Even you talk about food. There's a research institute that I've dealt with that all they do is their entire research is completely on smell and taste. That's it, and the relationship between those two. And so those are also issues that are going to come into play. A little bit about talking about even with small groups of people. It doesn't have to be 100 or 1,000. It can be 20 or 25. In these kinds of environments, certainly we have examples. We have examples in history from the military and other kinds of exploration. But some of the sociological aspects of this in your book, which I liked, one of the things you refer to as a company town, as some of the analog we have historically, which I thought was kind of an interesting way to look at it. But it seems to me, I know we talk a lot about this, some of those kinds of issues that we're going to be dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, where to start? There's so many. So mostly what we did for the book was like I would go to conferences and workshops, and I would listen to what people were telling me they thought early settlements would be like. And so some people said early settlements will be like company towns. Probably some company who wants to extract a resource will bring people out there. They'll provide everything for those people that they would need. Education, food, entertainment, etc. Very much like a company town. And so you'd ask like, okay, well, I've heard some bad stuff about company towns. Do we have any like a predictive structure for when things go wrong in company towns? And it does turn out that there are times when company towns are more likely to get violent than other times, for example. So for example, during unionization attempts, when there's like this big change happening, that's when violence is likely to happen. Or when the company has a lean period and they're cutting back on wages or something, that's when you're likely to get violence. And so there's ways that you can predict, like, okay, things are probably going to get tense when this happens, and have a plan in place for that. And, there's lots of people who have studied company towns. And then a lot of people also said that communal life is a really good model for settling space, because you're not going to want, for example, one kitchen for every family. That would just get out of control really quickly. And so you're going to have like a kitchen, and that kitchen's going to get used by everyone. Maybe you'll have a couple people who are doing the cooking for everyone, and just basically the expenses of sustaining yourself in space and the small spaces you're living in will require you to be communal. And so we'd ask, like, okay, well, I've heard a lot about 60s era communes, and most of them didn't make it. And so did we learn anything from that? And so Zach and I actually teamed up with a scholar who studied the kibbutz and another scholar who studied the Hutterites. And we said, okay, what are social problems that you usually get in communes, and what are the solutions for them that we could tell the space community about? And we wrote a paper that just came out in Space Policy on that. And so there's a lot of like social comparisons that people make, where there's people who have been studying this for decades, and there's a lot of like, they can help you understand what problems you might experience, but they don't seem to be getting like asked often, and their research doesn't seem to get consulted. And so there's a lot of social problems that we might be able to avoid if we just dug into the sociology literature a bit more.
Yeah. I think one of the issues with the space community, and it's not meant to be across the board, but it can be somewhat insular, not reaching out to people from different areas and different knowledge bases and saying, hey, I know you're not, quote, space technology scientist, but we'd like to know, how do you think about this? How have you dealt with these kinds of problems? It's funny when you say, company town, because I mentioned earlier when we were offline, I happen to live in Kentucky. And of course, there's a great example in the eastern part of Kentucky in the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia and Virginia of company towns that existed for decades in these mining communities. And there's a lot of experience and issues that came not just about the sociological aspects, but the governance issues in those towns, and how they dealt with them, how they dealt with the people that were there. So I think those are, and in terms of what kind of other evidence have you seen in terms of the sociological aspects? Some of these early expeditions where you had people go out into somewhat similar circumstances, but they didn't know what they were going to have to confront.
Yeah, that's we actually ended we did try to write a chapter. We were interested in this question of like 10 to 20 people, these sort of smaller group sizes. There is a field of study called group dynamics. I would say our impression from having read it is there's lots of knowledge, but there's not like a lot of predictive power, which is not too surprising. So, the tough thing is the kind of advice you end up being able to give is something like, make sure to have good leaders and not bad leaders, and make sure to have a selection process. But beyond that, I think you sort of wish like there were more knobs to turn. Like I think once you get to like when you're talking about ecology, you can start answering questions about like, well, what type of plants do you want and what arrangement or something. Or when you're talking about like medical stuff, we know like experiments we would like to do. But with something like predicting the group dynamics of 20 people, it seemed like the best answer to the question was to let them work together in advance of the project and make sure they work together well. Beyond that, there is a lot of knowledge of selection, meaning like winnowing out who gets to go and who doesn't. So I actually think that's probably your best bet. Like one trivial thing we talk about is usually people who go into space, and almost certainly people who go to Mars, are going to be somewhere in middle age, like at least in their 30s. And partially that's a seniority thing, but also because, if you look at cases from the era of polar exploration, when people had like major psychological issues, you think of like the Mawson expedition, or was it the Franklin expedition, had issues with like psychoses or behavioral problems. Usually it's young men. And a lot of behavioral disorders don't show up fairly early in life. So like stuff like that is probably your best bet, rather than trying to sort of have a predictive, like people get into like, well, you would want exactly 12 women and 8 men, and they should be this age and from these places. And that stuff, I don't know that there's a lot of predictive power.
Yeah, one of the things I find interesting in talking to some colleagues at NASA, some of the research they've done, and is that what they have found is that female astronauts consume considerably less calories.
Yes. Yeah. We actually
than men, which raises some interesting questions in terms of the mix.
Yes. Yeah.
But they also consume less oxygen. So China has Lunar Palace, and they're working on a closed loop ecosystem. So they're trying to use the plants to generate the oxygen and to scrub out the carbon dioxide. And they're, trying to control waste and water and blah, blah, blah. And one of their simulation runs had 3 big men in it, and they were producing too much carbon dioxide and not enough oxygen. And so they swapped out 2 men for 2 smaller women, and then they had enough oxygen. So needless to say, if that had to happen on Mars, they would just be dead. But it's hard to know if it's women or just smaller mass people. Like
Right.
Zach joked that you should send a lot of jockeys to space.
Yeah.
So-
No, that's about, no, I agree.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
I
to put a
agree.
little like math on that, like my recollection, I haven't looked into this in a little while, but my recollection is on average it's literally 15% less consumables, which means if you were going to send 6 people, you could send 7 if you're just looking at consumables. So it is non-trivial.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, yeah, I agree. I thought it was kind of interesting. Again, I think a lot of these challenges we face in space require out of the box thinking. And require us as humans to really think differently and to pose challenges to ourselves that may seem to be impossible at first, but to try to work those through, because that's how like discoveries often happen. I'm, having actually I haven't seen the movie, but reading a book on Oppenheimer, I mean, that's what happened during that period, was an example of people doing the unimaginable, but working through it and saying, we finding ways that do things when things couldn't be done. And I think that's really important. The other thing too is that, in terms of sociological, obviously there's going to be some massive differences and changes if we find out in terms of communities in space, if we are not able to safely reproduce in space.
Yeah.
That's a whole different dynamic in terms of the people who are going to be able to go.
Sure is. Yeah.
Yeah, gosh, where to even start there? I mean, you can imagine Mars being a place where you retire if like probably 40% gravity is nicer on the bones. And maybe you're more comfortable if you can survive the radiation, but a lot of radiation guidelines scale with age because it takes a while for cancer to kick in. And so maybe if you are older when you go, if you can't have kids, then you're never really going to have what Zach and I would think of as a settlement.
Yeah.
So one of the workshops that I was at, a woman was saying that we might not be able to settle space until we figure out artificial wombs. And she's a medical doctor. And so she was concerned about problems with radiation in particular. She was saying that if you have an artificial womb, then you can, clad that womb with radiation, with material to protect against radiation. And so, maybe we could get around the problem with technology eventually, but yeah, it's
well, but also the other thing about that, like sociologically, like if it is not safe or ethical to have children, then are you going to have like a no, everyone must have enforced birth control, or so you're going to so usually a lot of times when people have ideas about Mars settlement, they're very like freedom oriented, like we're going to have a more free, more vibrant society. But if we're saying actually some sort of top down authority is going to say no one's allowed to go without birth control, you're already interceding in places where even fairly authoritarian governments often don't go.
Charles Cattell has sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I read a science fiction book a number of years ago, a story of interplanetary travel. And the way they dealt with it is when astronauts got selected, either male or female, the first thing they did was they had to be sterilized.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's not crazy.
I know. But, I know. So that's how they dealt with it in this story.
Yeah.
One of the, I'm going to transition here a little bit to talk, and I'll blend these kind of together a little bit. It's on the economic and business side. In fact, we have a question that came out, a comment from somebody who said he's a particle physicist and read the book and really found himself most enchanted, he or she, by the part on the legal aspects and some of those kinds of things, which are obviously also huge issues, not only from a standpoint of economics, business, but also in terms of conflict and things like that. So one of the things that I think most, there's a lot of uncertainty about is this whole issue of, what are the rules going to be and how are we going to enforce them? We've had several comments from Elon Musk recently where, he's made the claim that, Mars is kind of open season. that there's not many rules that apply. And, he's there are other people who feel like he does and others who don't. But you have actually a quite lengthy section in the book about these issues. So let me turn to that for a second.
Sure. So there is space law. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty through the United Nations is ratified by all the major spacefaring countries. And the parts that pertain to space settlement are that you are not allowed to appropriate any land. So, when the US landed on the moon and we put our flag down, we weren't saying this belongs to the US now, because that's not allowed under international law. But it's unclear if you're allowed to extract and sell resources, for example. And so the US's interpretation right now is that extracting and selling resources is a thing that's very different than sovereignty. So Obama signed the Space Competitiveness Act saying that it's okay for American citizens to extract and sell resources. Donald Trump signed an executive order essentially saying the same thing. And NASA in 2020 came out with the Artemis Accords, which has been signed by more than 20 countries now, that reiterates that we think it's okay to extract and sell resources. On the other hand, we were talking to Chris Lewicki at Planetary Resources, and this was a few years ago, so maybe the landscape has changed a little. And this was after Planetary Resources stopped being a thing. But he was saying that one problem that they had with investors was they didn't feel like there was enough clarity in terms of international law. And so if you're going to invest millions, billions of dollars for the technology to extract resources, you'd like to be sure that when you get them back to get them back to Earth, there's going to be a market. Or if you try to sell them to people who are already living on the moon, that you're going to legally be able to sell that stuff. So there's still some confusion about what's allowed up there. We're a little bit worried about there being conflict for the best parts of the moon, because again, there's not clarity about who's allowed to go where and how long you can stay there. But yeah, so I think that's slowing investments at the moment.
Yeah, let me read something from your book, a quote from Andy Weir, which I thought was really interesting, because I think it gets to the heart of this. Ultimately, it comes down to human nature.
Yeah.
Us as a species and humans, we can talk a lot about what we should do or we shouldn't do, but fundamentally, it comes down to who have we been, who are we, and are we really going to know why do we think we're going to be anything different when we're in space? And he makes this comment, says, idyllic views of the future always seem to come with the hidden assumption that human nature will change. This somehow the flaws of mankind will just melt away, the awesomeness of living among the stars. People will abandon mundane flaws like booze and drugs, and everybody will be super efficient, et cetera, et cetera. But that's never been the case as we march forward, and I don't see why it will happen in the future. Yep. And I think that's a real, I've talked about a real issue. I mean, people talk about, laws and, you can't do this and you can't do that in space. Well, we also have treaties and laws on Earth that say you can't invade other countries. But people don't necessarily pay attention to that.
There are consequences, though. So you're totally right. And so I think the analogy that we try to make here, or that we make with our friends, is that, murder is illegal, but still sometimes people get away with it. And it's an imperfect system. And yes, Russia should not have invaded Ukraine, but a bunch of countries came together to sanction Russia because they had violated the norm of territorial integrity. And so, there are punishments, but they are often not what you'd like them to be. So, for example, if Elon Musk goes to Mars and he says, I am starting a nation on Mars, and this is Moscow or something, that would be in violation of the Outer Space Treaty. And then it would be sort of up to the United States what they wanted to do. So according to the Outer Space Treaty, the United States would probably be responsible for Musk. He's probably launching from the US. He's a US citizen. So they'd probably be responsible. And so if he starts violating international law and the international community decides they're upset about it, they could sanction the US, and then the US would have to decide how they were going to get Elon Musk to get back in line. And they could do things like say, we're not going to give SpaceX any more launch permissions. You're not going to be able to let any of your rockets launch from the US anymore. You're not going to be able to get resupply ships to your Mars settlements. So there's things that they could do. Mm-hmm. The question is, will they do those things? And, and you're right. It's not a slam dunk, that international law.
And I think you raise a good point. It's a lot of these conflicts won't necessarily be fought in space. They'll be fought on Earth as well.
Yeah.
So it's not an either or proposition. It's both. You also, I think an example of this too is you also talked in your book about the Bogota Declaration. I think that was a good example of, we tried to do the thing whether people are paying attention to it. What was that about?
Sure. Bogota Declaration was that 1976? I
I
think
thought it was 73, but
Well, anyway, in the 70s, I think it was 8 equatorial nations tried to claim their respective chunks of geosynchronous orbit, meaning like the one orbit that is always in the same place over your head is geosynchronous. So these nations tried to say that part of space is ours. And the basic result was that nobody cared. To this day, Colombia has a clause in its constitution that claims that part of geosynchronous. But the basic deal is it runs afoul of the Outer Space Treaty. And importantly, that document is signed by the major space powers, the major powers generally. And importantly, also, those equatorial nations were not powerful. So you can imagine a world where China was equatorial and said, actually, this is our chunk of geosynchronous. And then maybe there would be something more complex geopolitically. But that wasn't what happened. The way we look at it is international law is real, but it's a kind of cultural dance. And people at the dance, some of them have more clout than others.
Right.
So it is complex.
Yes, it is very much. Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's again, in my mind, a lot of it just comes back to human nature. Wouldn't somebody mentioned here, actually someone I know, Suketu from Babazar, he mentioned, well, wouldn't Elon Musk just launch his rockets from Russia then? And of course, again, that's the whole issue of we can't get away from the problems on Earth, whether we want to or not. But, something that's interesting that happened recently that I think that relate to this, both in terms of law and conflict and in terms of economics, is two things. One, there was a recent mission to the moon. I think actually the lander crashed, but where they were taking up DNA and other kinds of things, human remains. And there was a indigenous tribe in the United States that said, well, this is the moon. We consider the moon sacred.
Yes.
And so, this gives us, we have problems with this. Not getting into that ethical, philosophical question, but what struck me was interesting is when they went to the authorities, including, I think, NASA authorities, and asked them about this, their response was, that's a private ship. We don't have anything to say about that. Which is interesting just in terms of the position they take, because that gets to the heart of what we're talking about. If that's the current position, well, that's a private company, and we really don't have any authority over that. Yeah. And then the second I want to bring up is when Starlink, Elon Musk company, decided to, as I believe, turn off certain capability of that system that affected the Ukrainians in a particular battle. And so think about that, one person, one company making a decision with a piece of space infrastructure in orbit that had profound effect on a lot of different people in a lot of different nations. So as we get into this, I think those are some of the things that we're really going to have. It's very unclear to me. I'm sure it's unclear to you, that I think it does speak to what you talk a lot about in your book, and that is the time to start dealing with these. You mentioned not just technology, but we need to start looking at some of the sociological processes and other kinds of things that we need to, because those are going to be just as important as the technical. Just like we say, well, we've got to perfect our propulsion systems, we better perfect our living systems as well.
I agree with all that. Yeah.
Yeah. And somebody mentioned real quick about, talking about, again, this gets into the economics and business aspects of space, which is a critical point that you guys alluded to, talking about intellectual property and how do we do that. And that's an area that's a little bit unclear. If you create a product in space, I was involved with a project at one point where we had put up some biological products and plants looking for structural changes for potential biomedical applications on Earth. And we, in fact, did see some structural changes in that. And so the question becomes, can you patent that? Something like that. And those are things that we'll have to work through.
Yeah, I think one thing to bring up that will also help with Suketu's question is, the answer to a lot of things is, what is the nationality of the people doing the thing?
Yeah.
If you want to know how the law is going to be applied, it can get a little complicated. If you're like on the ISS, for example, and you're, say, an American in the Russian module, then it gets weird because you're in Russian like quasi territory and you are an
Right.
American. But like with a question like IP, I mean, I don't know IP in particular, but my guess would be if you were you would be under your national law, and that gets to this question of would Elon launch rockets in Russia? It could be a little complicated, but he's an American citizen at least currently. The other thing is he has quite a few interests in the U.S. So if tomorrow Musk surprised the world by saying I've got a city on Mars run by Russia, it might negatively impact his business interests in the U.S., I suspect.
Yeah, we had a live session a while ago on interplanetary law and space law, and one of the speakers pointed out that, for example, on the moon, there's a particular deep crater that supposedly has large amounts of water available, but there's one way in and one way out. So there you get into a situation where, okay, I'm here first.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm happy to give you this water. I'm happy to sell it to you.
Yes.
But it belongs to me and I represent a company. And again, all of these things I think are just, they're complicated. They're fascinating. We don't know what the answers are. And just like we have throughout human history, we're going to have to try to figure these out as we go along, and hopefully we'll do it responsibly. I guess that's what we can hope for. I want to thank, we're out of time. I want to thank both of you again. The book is called A City on Mars, and Kelly and Zach are the authors. I strongly recommend you pick it up if you've enjoyed this conversation. It's even better reading the book. And I want to thank both of you again for being here today and talking about your book and writing the book as well. And just so everybody knows, we record all these webcasts. So in about a week or so, this webcast will be available on our YouTube channel at no charge. That's one of the value propositions we have at Humanity in Deep Space is we don't charge for anything because we think it's important to have a planetary conversation about these things. And so we don't want to put any obstacles or hurdles in the way of people engaging in these discussions. So again, let me thank all of our sponsors. Thank again, Kelly and Zach, and from Humanity in Deep Space. You can go to our website at humanityindeepspace.com. All of our former webcasts are on there and for up-to-date information. And we are always interested in hearing from you. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks.
We had a great time, and thanks for what you do. We love your webinar series.
Our continued exploration of space is accompanied by profound questions, responsibilities, and obligations. What is our place and ultimate responsibility to the larger universe? And how do we maintain a sense of humanity as we leave the planet Earth? These questions and more are discussed in our videos, as well as other curated content at www.humanityindeepspace.com or on YouTube by joining Humanity in Deep Space. The music for this episode was written and performed by Danny Grandstaff and is available at dannygrandstaff.bandcamp.com.